During World War II, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, became a symbol of the Soviet Union's resilient resistance against the fierce German invasion. From September 1941 to January 1944, the city endured a stifling siege, marked by dire shortages of food, clean water, and medical supplies. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died from starvation, cold, and shelling. As German forces tightened the steel ring around Leningrad to break its defenses, local residents and the Red Army fiercely defended every street, every factory. Yet behind these chronicles of determined resistance, certain accounts and documents also describe brutal reprisals against captured or wounded German soldiers in the surrounding area. These savage executions, rarely publicly discussed, serve as a reminder that in the vortex of war, atrocities can arise on all sides. In the summer of 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, unexpectedly attacking the Soviet Union. Leningrad, a major industrial and cultural hub, was in the German sights as they sought to strangle the city and use it to dominate the northern region. Beginning in September 1941, when the siege commenced, Leningrad was nearly cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. Even so, the road of life along Lake Ladoga allowed some small flow of food and supplies into the city. For nearly 900 days, German and Allied forces ceaselessly shelled and bombed Leningrad in an effort to break its will. The city's residents were severely weakened by hunger, and historical records even mention instances of cannibalism in certain desperate districts. At the strategic level, Hitler declared he would wipe the city off the map, refusing any compromise or surrender. This all-or-nothing atmosphere drove both sides, Soviet and German, to ramp up acts of violence, including executions seen as retribution or the unleashing of pent-up rage. When talking about Leningrad, one usually focuses on the plight of its besieged inhabitants, yet the German troops carrying out the blockade also faced considerable risks. The tighter they tried to seal their lines, the more they had to maintain trenches through harsh winters. Besides artillery and air raids, there were small-scale raids behind German lines by Soviet partisans or reconnaissance units. Certain German detachments, especially those that became isolated or strayed from the main force, fell into the hands of Soviet fighters or local militias. Upon capture, these German soldiers confronted intense Soviet anger, which stemmed largely from the city's catastrophic devastation. Tens of thousands died of starvation, entire neighborhoods were leveled, and factories and libraries lay in ruins. Amid such resentment, the abuse or execution of German prisoners became a likely outcome. Some accounts suggest that captured soldiers were at times beaten, interrogated, and then shot on the spot, without any formal questioning. Anecdotes speak of local partisan groups hanging or executing prisoners in front of civilian onlookers as revenge for the suffering the Germans had inflicted. Compared to the systematic approach the SS or Gestapo used on the Western Soviet front, these executions might not have been industrial scale or organized, but their cruelty could be extreme. While Germany built POW camps under harsh conditions, the Soviet side, especially in besieged Leningrad, also faced tremendous difficulties managing, feeding, or screening prisoners. Local commanders sometimes opted for swift purges rather than transporting prisoners to distant rear areas. Methods of execution varied, for example. Shooting at the front line. Prisoners were executed immediately upon surrender, sometimes citing no place for detention, or out of fury at the city's destruction. Torture and elimination. Some stories say partisan or scout units captured German troops, extracted information, and then killed them to keep secrecy. Public execution. In certain villages near Leningrad, surviving residents who had lost family to bombs or shell fire collaborated with Soviet units to execute prisoners publicly as vengeance. Neglect in makeshift prisons. In rare instances of temporary camps, the lack of food and medicine caused prisoners to waste away, effectively a slow death sentence rather than a direct execution. Research into these German soldier executions near Leningrad faces numerous difficulties. First, post-war Soviet authorities rarely released records on their own use of violence, emphasizing instead the justness of the Great Patriotic War. Second, German sources are not fully reliable. Some documents were lost or destroyed when the Red Army took Berlin in 1945. As a result, many stories are pieced together from veterans or local eyewitnesses, often mingling emotion and even embellishment. In the West, after the war, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg and other commissions on war crimes focused mainly on Nazi Germany's genocidal acts, the Holocaust, executions of civilians, Soviet POWs, etc. There were few detailed proceedings addressing crimes by the Allies or the Soviets, except for a few controversies involving the Polish exile forces, such as the Katyn massacre, which sparked much debate. This further relegated the topic of German soldiers purged at Leningrad to a historical gray area. To understand why German soldiers suffered such brutal fates near Leningrad, one must revisit the mindset among the Soviet populace at the time. The siege claimed the lives of over 1 million residents, an estimate that may not even fully capture reality. The city lay largely in ruins, constantly bombarded by German guns. Meanwhile, news of Nazi atrocities in occupied areas, mass killings of civilians, executions of POWs, torching villages, spread from all sides. Anger and a craving for payback surged. People who had just buried loved ones lost to starvation or rocket fire were unlikely to be merciful upon encountering the enemy. Likewise, many Red Army soldiers or local militia members had witnessed too many harrowing scenes. In the heat of battle, the line between preserving humanity and succumbing to violence grows dangerously thin. As a result, some vicious executions, whether spontaneous or commanded, found ample room to unfold. Once the war ended, the Soviet Union lauded Leningrad's defense as a heroic saga, celebrating the army and citizens' tenacity. Indeed, few cities endured casualties as high as Leningrad without surrendering. However, as with any conflict, where hatred accumulates, violence can turn extreme. Amid the grim realities of Leningrad's siege, there were indeed captured German soldiers who suffered merciless executions, even if few formal records remain. The siege's brutality reinforces a harsh truth. One side's cruelty often engenders equally harsh reprisals. Of course, degrees and scope differ, but ultimately, inhumane acts appeared on both fronts. Many historians believe that German soldiers who surrendered at Leningrad or were captured on adjacent fronts, rarely received Geneva Convention protections. This was partly because the Soviet Union did not fully acknowledge or comply with it, and partly because revenge drove reactions. This stark subject, the brutal execution of German soldiers of Leningrad, represents a particularly violent fragment of the larger picture surrounding the siege. Most historical narratives focus on the city's suffering from hunger and shellfire, which caused enormous losses. Yet it must be acknowledged that, in a climate of overwhelming fury, some German captives met savage ends, driven by vengeful impulses or unbridled rage. Over time, we see that war crimes are never the exclusive domain of one side. Comparing one atrocity with another is difficult, for every illegal killing, torture, or execution leaves its mark on humanity's conscience. Leningrad stands for an unyielding spirit, but it also reveals how collective fear and rage can bring out a darker side of human behavior. The brutal executions that took place there serve as a caution. Humaneness can vanish swiftly when hatred and violence take the upper hand.